About 3 years ago, my life completely turned upside down. At the time, I was living a pretty standard life, married to my now ex-wife Megan. Things weren't exactly a fairy tale, but they were comfortable enough. I had a steady job, Megan had her own thing going on, and we were talking about starting a family at some point. Nothing rushed, just vague future plans. It was the kind of routine life most people don't think twice about until something shatters it, and that something hit hard and fast, literally. I got into a car accident. It was one of those miserable gray days where everything seems to go wrong and you just want to get home and forget it ever happened. I remember sitting in traffic, frustrated and exhausted, when out of nowhere, a car blew through a red light. I didn't even have time to react. Just bam, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, feeling like I'd been flattened by a steamroller. The doctors kept me for a while to make sure nothing serious was wrong beyond the obvious bruises and broken bones. Eventually, I was sent home to recover. I spent weeks just trying to feel like myself again. But as the bruises faded and the fractures healed, I started noticing something was off. My energy was completely drained, like I'd gone from being in my 30s to my 60s overnight. I chalked it up to lingering trauma from the accident. But eventually, I got some tests done, and the news blindsided me. The accident had left me with more than just physical injuries. It had also affected my fertility. In one moment, I'd gone from imagining myself as a future dad to facing the reality that I might never be able to have kids. It was surreal and devastating, a hit that struck deeper than any injury. I remember leaving the doctor's office in a daze, thinking, this changes everything. Telling Megan about it was difficult, but I figured she'd be supportive. She was shocked at first, but her reaction was muted. She didn't cry. She didn't even seem that surprised once the shock wore off. She just nodded like I'd told her I'd forgotten to pick up the milk. It was surreal and it hurt more than I'd expected. I was going through this massive shift, my entire future rewritten in a way I hadn't chosen, and she just sat there. After that conversation, a silence settled between us. Megan wasn't mean or confrontational, just distant. I tried to convince myself that she was just processing everything. Maybe she needed time to come to terms with it. But as the weeks passed, that distance grew wider. She seemed to shut down whenever I tried to bring up the topic. I'd ask if she wanted to talk and she'd just brush it off with, "We'll figure it out," or "Let's not worry about it right now." Every attempt I made to connect, to work through this together, felt like I was speaking into an empty room while I was struggling with my own feelings. The idea of fatherhood had always been important to me. I'd pictured myself as a dad someday and imagined what it would be like to raise a kid. And now that dream was gone, and the one person I thought would be by my side was acting like it was barely worth mentioning. The whole thing left me feeling like I was facing this enormous, life-altering change completely alone. As if that wasn't enough, I soon realized I couldn't rely on my parents either. They'd always been supportive, the traditional type who loved the idea of family gatherings, grandchildren, all the cliches. So when I told them about the accident and what it had done to me, I expected sympathy, maybe even some encouragement. What I got was silence. They asked how I was healing physically, but there was no mention of my emotional state, no acknowledgement of how losing the chance for kids was affecting me. When I finally told them about the fertility issues, my dad just gave a solemn nod, and my mom gave me a pitying look, then changed the subject. They started talking about some random cousin's wedding, completely ignoring the bombshell I'd just dropped. I kept waiting for them to check in, to offer some comfort, or even just ask how I was coping, but they didn't. And it wasn't long before I realized they'd started calling less often, too. My mom, who used to call multiple times a week, was suddenly only calling once every couple of weeks, if that. And each time the conversation was stilted, like she didn't actually want to talk. I tried bringing it up with her one day, hoping maybe I was just imagining things. I told her that I was struggling and that I needed support. She paused, sighed, and said, "Well, it's just a shame, isn't it?" That was it. No comfort, no "we're here for you." Just a shame. And that's when it hit me. My wife was pulling away, and my parents, the people I thought would always be there, were treating me like I was some broken part that didn't fit into their perfect vision of life. My value to them had dropped, all because I couldn't give them what they wanted. After that, I started feeling like a stranger in my own life. I'd go to work, come home to silence, and sit in my empty apartment, trying to wrap my head around everything. Over and over, the same question kept looping in my mind. Was my only worth to these people tied to whether or not I could have kids? As the weeks dragged on, Megan kept pulling away. It was subtle at first, a missed dinner here, an excuse about work there. But it didn't take long before I started feeling like I was living with a stranger. Every night we'd sit across from each other at the dinner table in complete silence, and when I'd try to start a conversation, she'd respond with one-word answers or just nod, barely looking up. It was like we were playing some sad version of House, going through the motions while both of us knew there was nothing left holding it together. I'd lay awake at night, just staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with ways to make things right. I kept telling myself that if I could just find the right words or do the right thing, maybe I could bring her back. But every time I tried to talk about our future, she'd shut it down and brush me off, like my worries were an inconvenience. At that point, it was painfully clear. I was in this alone. One night I sat her down, desperate to get some clarity. I told her that we needed to talk, thinking maybe this could be the turning point. I poured my heart out, explaining how lost I felt and how scared I was about our future, and asked if we were still in this together. I just wanted something, anything, that would show me she was still with me. But Megan just sighed, looked down at her phone and said, "I'm exhausted. Can we not do this right now?" I can't fully explain how that felt, like something inside me broke. I realized right then that she'd already checked out. She was halfway out the door, just waiting for the right moment to make it official. After that night, I didn't bother bringing it up again. What was the point? Every effort I made to connect was met with a wall of indifference. It felt like I was pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it, hoping each drop would be the one to make a difference. Around this time, my parents' silence became deafening too. I'd tried calling them, hoping maybe they'd be the support I couldn't find at home, but every conversation felt forced, like they were just doing it out of obligation. My mom would say things like, "Oh well, life goes on," and it became clear that to them, my problems weren't worth their energy. I was watching everyone who was supposed to care about me slowly drift away. One night, after another dinner filled with silence, I decided to ask Megan if she was okay. It wasn't an accusation. I was genuinely worried about us, about her, about what was happening to our marriage. I was half hoping she'd laugh, tell me I was overthinking things, and reassure me that we were fine. Instead, she looked at me with this tired, empty expression and said, "I don't know if this is what I want anymore." That hit me like a punch in the gut. She didn't say it with anger or sadness, just a cold, flat statement that made it clear she'd already mentally left. I tried to keep my composure and asked her what she meant, hoping she'd give me something to work with. But she just shrugged and muttered, "Maybe we're just too different, too different. We'd been together for years, shared a life, plans, and memories. Now suddenly we were too different? It felt like I'd woken up in a bad dream. Everything familiar just twisted slightly out of place, but she'd clearly made up her mind. I asked if there was anything I could do to make things right and get back to the life we'd built together. She just shook her head saying, "It's not about you, it's about what I want. For weeks after that conversation, I tried everything I could think of to make things work. I picked up the slack around the house, tried organizing little date nights, and made an effort to be there for her in every way I knew how. But nothing changed. She'd go through the motions, eat the meals, watch the movies, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't there. Whatever spark we'd had was long gone. Then one evening, I came home from work and found her sitting on the couch with a stack of papers in front of her. My stomach dropped instantly, like I already knew what those papers meant. She didn't even try to ease into it. She just handed me the divorce papers and said, "I think this is what's best for both of us." I sat there stunned, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I asked her if we could work things out, but she just shook her head, not even looking at me. She said she'd been thinking about this for a while and had reached her limit. I was falling apart inside, but I somehow kept it together, nodded and signed the papers. When she walked out the door, she didn't look back, not once. I sat there alone in our empty apartment, surrounded by pieces of a life that no longer existed. All our shared memories, the future we'd once dreamed of, had been reduced to a single stark reality. I was on my own. In the days that followed, I tried to reach out to my parents, hoping maybe they'd see what I was going through and finally be there for me. I left voicemails and sent messages, but every single one went unanswered. It was as if I'd been erased from their lives, like I didn't even exist to them anymore. These were the people who raised me, who I thought would always have my back, and now, when I needed them most, they'd abandoned me. Coming home every day to that empty apartment was brutal. I was surrounded by silence, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work or mindless TV, but the loneliness was crushing. There was this creeping feeling that kept growing stronger, a sense that maybe I really didn't matter, that maybe I was just invisible. And even though I tried to tell myself it wasn't true, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe everyone was right to turn their backs on me. Maybe I was the problem. I went through all the reasons they could have had to leave, replayed every argument, every strained silence. But deep down, I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd done my best to hold everything together, to be the person they needed me to be. But somehow that just wasn't enough. So there I was, left with nothing but questions I'd never get answers to. My wife was gone, my parents were ghosts, and the life I thought I'd have was a fading dream. The people I loved, the ones I thought would always stand by me, had disappeared at the first sign of trouble. I wish I could say I moved on quickly, that I found peace and clarity overnight, but that wouldn't be the truth. Every day was a struggle, trying to make sense of the emptiness. But as painful as it was, that silence forced me to confront the reality of my situation. I had to accept that maybe for the first time in my life, I was truly alone. It was only after Megan left and my parents had gone radio silent that I started realizing the real reason behind their actions. I hadn't just failed to give them what they wanted. I'd failed to fit into their idea of what my life should look like. And in their eyes, that was unforgivable. The realization stung, but it was also a kind of wake-up call. For the first time, I started to understand that their love was conditional. It wasn't about me. It was about what I could give them. And if I couldn't give them that, well, then I was nothing to them. And as I sat in that quiet apartment surrounded by the wreckage of my old life, I made a decision. I was done bending over backward to meet other people's expectations. If I was going to rebuild, I'd do it for me, not for anyone else. Months passed, and little by little I adjusted to life on my own. I wish I could say I embraced it wholeheartedly, but in truth, it was a rough, bitter transition. Every day was a reminder of what I'd lost. Friends would occasionally reach out, but even then, I felt like they were tiptoeing around me, like they didn't know how to act now that my life didn't look like theirs. I could see the pity in their eyes, the awkward pauses when they'd start to talk about their kids or their partners. It felt like I was living on the outskirts of the world I used to belong to. Then, just when I thought I'd finally gotten a grip on things, my parents decided to make a reappearance in the most bizarre way possible. Out of nowhere, my mom called me up and said she and my dad wanted to stop by and check on me. I hadn't heard from either of them in months, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this was them finally reaching out, finally realizing I needed some family in my life. When they showed up, though, they didn't bring comfort or support. Instead, they brought boxes of my childhood things, dusty trophies, old school certificates, and projects from years ago that I barely even remembered. They unloaded it all in the middle of my living room, acting like they were doing me some huge favor. When I asked why, my mom just shrugged and said, "Well, we're turning your old room into a nursery for when your sister has a family dot." That hit me like a slap. My sister wasn't even dating anyone, and yet here they were, emptying out my old room to make space for the hypothetical grandkids they might actually get. I felt like I was being scrubbed out of their lives, my existence erased and replaced by some imaginary future that had no room for me in it. I confronted them and told them how hurtful this was. My dad looked at me and said, "Well, you're not exactly using the space anymore, are you?" It felt like they weren't even trying to hide it. I'd failed them, and they were moving on, making room for the family they wanted, not the one they had. After they left, I knew I couldn't keep giving them chances. This wasn't the kind of support I needed in my life. So I decided to pull back and put up a boundary to give myself some space. but they weren't about to let me have peace. My mom started calling from different numbers, trying to reach me after I'd stopped picking up. Then her friends started messaging me, saying things like, "Your mom is heartbroken. You need to be there for your family." It was like they'd organized a whole guilt-tripping campaign, acting like I was some ungrateful son abandoning his parents. Then, as if that wasn't enough, my dad showed up unannounced at my door one Saturday morning with my cousin Luke. Now Luke had always been the family's wild child, the one who dropped out of school, never held down a job, and was always calling someone for a favor. Apparently, he'd lost his latest place to crash, and my dad had somehow decided my apartment was the perfect spot for him. Without even asking, my dad started unloading Luke's bags, treating it like it was a done deal. When I asked what he was doing, he looked at me and said, "Luke's family. We all help each other out when times are tough." The irony almost made me laugh. Where was that help when I was at my lowest? I told him flat out that Luke wasn't staying with me and that he'd have to find somewhere else to go. My dad looked at me with this disgusted expression, muttering about how selfish I'd become. But I didn't back down, and eventually he left, taking a sulking Luke with him. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that they'd finally leave me alone. But a few weeks later, I came home to find a thick envelope stuffed in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from my mom, a handwritten one, dripping with passive aggressiveness. She went on and on about how I was tearing the family apart, and how I'd become someone she didn't even recognize. But then, the final paragraph made my blood boil. She wrote that they decided I should sign over a portion of my inheritance to my sister, for her future family. They didn't even try to disguise it. They were asking me to give away part of what would have been mine to fund the family they still had hope for, all because I wasn't fulfilling their dreams of grandchildren. I was furious. This wasn't just crossing a line. It was completely erasing it. I called her, and when she picked up, I told her exactly how I felt, how hurtful it was to see them discard me, how it felt like they'd been using me as some means to an end, and now that I couldn't give them what they wanted, I was disposable. She was silent for a while, then sighed and said, "We just want what's best for the family. You don't understand because you're choosing to be selfish." I knew then that nothing I said would ever make a difference. I could have given them every penny I had, sacrificed everything, and it still wouldn't be enough. They'd always find some reason to look at me as a disappointment. So I made a decision right there. I was done. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call them back. Instead, I blocked their numbers and prepared myself for whatever they'd try next. I knew they wouldn't give up, but I wasn't going to let them hurt me anymore. Sure enough, about a week later, my mom showed up at my door, banging on it like she was about to knock it down. When I opened up, she didn't even say hello. She just barged in, looking around like she was inspecting my place for cleanliness, and then went off on a tirade about family obligations and duty. She had the nerve to act like I was some kind of ungrateful child, like I'd wronged them by simply not meeting their expectations. I told her I wasn't giving anything to my sister, that I didn't owe her or anyone else a part of my life. My mom just looked at me, absolutely disgusted, and said, "Well, if that's the way you want it, don't expect to be part of this family anymore." I stood there, stunned. But then it hit me. That was exactly what I wanted. After she left, I felt this strange, heavy relief. For the first time, I could see the truth. I'd been living my whole life trying to live up to their version of family, bending over backward to meet expectations that were impossible. And the moment I failed, they'd turned on me without a second thought. I realized I didn't want that kind of family in my life. I wanted peace. And finally, I was okay with walking away to find it. In the months after I cut my family off, I finally started feeling like myself again. It wasn't instant. It was more like a slow rebuilding, piecing together the parts of myself I'd left scattered over the years. At first, I worried about whether they'd show up again or try to pull some stunt to reel me back in, but they didn't. For once, my silence actually seemed to get through to them. I threw myself into work, picked up some new hobbies, and even reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from. I wanted to see if I could carve out a life that was just mine without the weight of everyone else's expectations. It was around this time that I decided to sign up for a photography class at the community center. something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. And that's where I met Elena. It wasn't some grand romantic meeting. She was just another person in the class. But I noticed her because she had this calm, easygoing energy. She didn't talk much at first, just focused on the lessons. But there was something about her that made me want to know more. As we worked through assignments and started chatting, I realized she was one of those rare people who could make anything interesting. She'd take a picture of the most random thing, a crack in the sidewalk or a rain puddle, and somehow make it feel like it had a story. One day after class, a group of us decided to go out for coffee, and I ended up sitting next to Elena. We started talking, and it was like we'd known each other for years. We weren't sharing life secrets or anything, just swapping stories about favorite movies, weird travel experiences, and why we both chose a photography class instead of watching tutorials online. There was no awkwardness, no trying to impress each other. It was just easy. Over the next few weeks, we started hanging out more. Sometimes we'd go for a walk after class. Other times we'd grab a quick bite or maybe hit up an art show. It wasn't about doing anything special. It was just being around each other. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about being judged or falling short. I could just be me, and she seemed to like that. Then one night, after we'd grabbed dinner at this little diner, I found myself opening up to her. I told her about my past, about Megan, the accident, my family, and the reality I'd faced with my infertility. I was half expecting her to give me a pitying look or say something awkward, but she just nodded along, listening with this quiet understanding. When I finished, she didn't give me some canned response. She just looked me in the eye and said, "That sounds like a lot. You must be pretty strong to get through it all." I don't know why, but that one sentence felt like the most validating thing anyone had ever said to me. She didn't act like I was broken or brush off my pain. She just got it, in a way no one else had. And I knew then that this was more than just a friendship. A few weeks later, I asked her out properly. I was nervous as hell, but she just smiled and said, "I'd love to." Dating Elena was unlike anything I'd experienced before. There was no pressure, no sense of walking on eggshells. With her, I didn't feel like I had to constantly prove my worth or chase after some elusive ideal. I could just exist, and for the first time, that was enough. We started spending nearly every weekend together, exploring the city, finding random food trucks, or just hanging out at the park. She even got me back into photography in a serious way. It felt like a piece of me I hadn't realized was missing had finally clicked back into place. I hadn't felt this alive, this free, in years. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my doctor with news I'd never expected. After some follow-ups and tests, they discovered that the treatments I'd gone through for my injuries had actually worked better than anyone thought. The doctor told me that I was fully capable of having kids. No more treatments, no more doubts. Just like that, a door I thought was closed forever had swung wide open. I remember telling Elena, half expecting her to freak out, but she just smiled, that same calm way she always did, and said, "Maybe it was meant to be." Her grounded reaction made the news feel less overwhelming, and somehow it just fit into our story. A few months later, we found out we were expecting. It felt like a dream, one I hadn't dared to have since the accident. When we found out we'd be having a little girl, I could hardly believe it. Elena started picking out names and baby outfits, and I'd find myself wandering through stores, holding tiny shoes, picturing our daughter learning to walk, run, and grow. After everything I'd gone through, the idea of becoming a dad felt like a miracle. We kept things quiet. I'd long since let go of any need to tell my family or try to rekindle old connections. I didn't see any point in reaching out to people who'd chosen to turn their backs on me. I'd built my own life, and for the first time, it was a life that felt like it truly belonged to me. One afternoon, Elena and I took our daughter, who was just a few months old, out for a walk in the neighborhood. She was asleep in the stroller, and we were chatting about silly things, future plans, everything and nothing. It was one of those days where everything just felt right. Then, as we turned the corner, I saw them, my parents. They were coming out of a house down the street, and it looked like they were visiting someone in the area. My heart dropped. I hadn't seen them in over a year, and part of me wanted to turn around and pretend I hadn't seen them. But it was too late. They spotted us. My mom's face lit up when she saw us, her eyes locking on the stroller. She nudged my dad and they walked over, both of them smiling like they'd just found some long-lost treasure. They looked at our daughter, then at me, like they couldn't believe I'd actually gone on to have a family without them. My dad was the first to speak. "We're glad to see you're doing well. We've missed you." It was surreal, like they were trying to gloss over everything that had happened. Memories of their cold rejection, the way they'd turned their backs on me, flooded my mind. Here they were, acting like a few forgotten words could patch over years of silence and pain. I kept my tone calm, but I didn't hold back. I told them flat out, "You walked out of my life when I needed you most. You made me feel like I was nothing when I couldn't give you what you wanted. And now you just expect to walk back in?" My mom looked stunned, and my dad just stood there not saying a word. They started to explain, talking about how hard it was for them back then, as if they'd been the ones suffering. I could feel the anger boiling up, but I wasn't going to let them twist things. I'd fought too hard to heal and to build a life of my own. I looked them in the eye and told them, "I'm not going to pretend like nothing happened. I don't need you in my life, and neither does my daughter." My mom started pleading, saying they'd do anything to make things right, but I wasn't interested. I'd given them enough chances. When my mom reached toward the stroller, asking to meet their granddaughter, I stepped in front, putting myself between them and my daughter. I told them, "You lost that right. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." They looked completely shocked, as if they couldn't believe I'd actually shut them out. But I was done letting them have power over me. I turned the stroller around and walked away with Elena by my side, never looking back. As we walked home, Elena squeezed my hand, and I felt this incredible sense of peace. For the first time, I'd stood up for myself without guilt or fear. I'd finally closed the door on a painful past, and I was ready to move forward. Looking down at my daughter, asleep in her stroller, I knew I'd made the right decision. I'd given her the best gift I could, the promise that she'd grow up surrounded by people who truly loved her, people who would never walk away when things got hard. That was the day I let go for good, finally free to build the life I'd always deserved. I had my family, my real family, and that was all I needed. Story 2. I was 12 when my father wed his new bride. By that time, Mom had been gone for around 4 years. In all honesty, it seemed strange to see Dad with someone else, and I was still getting accustomed to the thought of her being gone. The new wife appeared to be well enough and wasn't horrible at all. However, when she moved in with her little daughter, everything was different. The young child, who was about 2 or 3 years old, was the focus of their universe from the beginning. All of a sudden, she became the center of attention in our home. It wasn't like I was thrilled to be thrown into this new family. I was still coping with the loss of my mother. I was still figuring things out 4 years after my mother's death. Dad never really talked about it, but I would catch him staring at me almost like he felt bad. We only went through the motions of attempting to fit in as a family, but it felt uncomfortable, as if we were all acting as though nothing was wrong. My mother's engagement ring, however, was the only item I still possessed of her. Our family has owned that ring for many generations. She received it from my grandmother, who had always maintained that it was destined to be handed along. I was holding on to the last remnant of her. I could hold on to some family history. It was a bit too large for my fingers, so I put it on a necklace. It served as a small reminder that my mother was still with me every time I looked at it. The youngster was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer almost a year after the father remarried and the daughter of his new wife. Back then, I wasn't really sure what that meant, but I knew it was serious. The atmosphere in the house changed from strained to simply depressing. Everything revolved around her medical appointments, therapies, and any other requirements she might have. Everyone was at the hospital, so when I would get home from school, nobody was there. Most evenings, I would eat by myself, hearing the house's silence, and generally felt further alienated. Then one day, with that serious expression on his face, Dad sat me down in the living room. Although it wasn't accessible in the area, he informed me that they had discovered an experimental therapy that could benefit the girl. The expenses were outrageous, and they would have to spend many months somewhere else. Due to their limited finances and the absence of his new wife's family, They were searching for alternative sources of funding. He asked whether we might sell Mom's engagement ring after giving me a serious look. At first, I didn't get it. For example, how was that related to anything? In her will, she left me the ring, which was mine. There was more than simply ostentatious jewelry to sell. At times, it seemed to be all that remained of her. I informed him so, and Doctor sighed before stating that this therapy may save her life. It, quote, is not as though it's only for amusement. I recall sitting there and looking at him, wondering whether he truly believed that taking something away from me was okay. He made an effort to claim that it was for the greater benefit, that the goal was to save a life. Yes, I get that, but I was just 13 at the time, and he was requesting that I give up the one item that still linked me to my mother. When I attempted to express it to him, he labeled me selfish, and I wasn't sure how to do it without coming out as such. Since he would be taking something away from me that I would never get back, I informed him that I wouldn't forgive him if he sold it. He didn't listen, though. The ring was gone the next thing I knew, sold for $14,000. It just took him $14,000 to sell out. My mother's final possession. Later, he attempted to discuss it with me, but I refused to listen. It seemed to me that he had just taken something that wasn't his. Something he would never comprehend that meant far more to me. Things were strange between us after that. I started to distance myself from him and become more private. It seemed like I was seeing him live this new life without me when I saw him with his wife and their children. I could feel my fury rising every time I glanced at him. I would feel like screaming at him to express my hatred for what he had done. However, I suppressed it. It didn't matter, I thought. He had already decided. I just tried to concentrate on friends and school for a time, anything to divert my attention. However, the sense of betrayal persisted. I would feel alienated in my own home every day when I saw them all together. That ring was only the last indication that he had already decided to choose his new family over me. Even when they would leave me alone at home to attend to her medical appointments. It was not as though I was relieved. I was only in this home, surrounded by memories that no one else cared about. I stopped discussing anything significant with him. I only provide brief responses when he asks about school. When he attempted to organize a joint activity, I would dismiss him, acting as though I wasn't interested or busy. I had a part of me hoping he would see, understand what he had done, and say sorry. However, he never did. He would continue to act as if nothing were wrong and attempt to make things work. I was already making plans for my escape by the time I was almost 18. I was aware that I had to leave that house. It was like a new wound every time I remembered how he had sold Mom's ring. It seemed as if he had put the demands of his new family above my right to have a connection to her. I began to save as much as I could, preparing to go. I wanted to leave, a long way from a place that no longer felt like home. Some may argue that I was exaggerating, but when you're 13 and someone takes something so significant away from you, it throws your head for a loop. The ring itself isn't everything. What it stood for is what matters. I was connected to a family through that ring. I had lost the ability to recall my mother in a clear and concise manner. It was like losing her again when I lost it. And nobody knew that. Not my dad in particular. My dad sold the ring, and the years that followed were odd. Maybe I'll get used to it, I thought, as if I'd be able to go on and let it go someday. However, that just did not occur. The contempt and wrath, if anything, continued to grow. Every time I look at my dad, I see the man who stole the one thing my mom had left and gave it away as if it were nothing. The man who chose someone else's child above his own. The fact that I felt like a shadow in their new family throughout those years didn't help either. I quickly realized that I couldn't rely on him for anything, including assistance. On some days, they wouldn't even be there when I got home. I would be left to fend for myself when they were away for a hospital visit or overnight with friends close to the treatment facility. They attempted to set me up with meals and everything, like they'd put frozen dinners in the freezer or even get a neighbor to check in on me. But it always felt like an afterthought, like they had their priorities and I just wasn't one of them. And let me tell you, it was hard to shake off the sensation of being forgotten. I quote, sit in that lonely home, knowing they were out there trying to help her. and I'd just become angrier, upset that they'd left me to take care of myself. Mostly upset that this was meant to be my home, but also upset that my dad didn't seem to care. It didn't feel like one, though. I felt as though I was a stranger in my own home. Early on, I made the decision that I would leave as quickly as possible. I began taking part-time jobs and saved as much money as I could. I worked as a babysitter and a lawnmower before landing a job at a grocery shop on the weekends and after school. It was something, but not much. I had a straightforward strategy: save enough money and leave when you're 18. I wanted no further reminders of what he had done or what I had lost. Things became much more tense as I reached my final year. Every now and then, my dad would attempt to have these father-daughter conversations in which he expressed his pride in me. How did he know I would achieve great things? However, it sounded like meaningless words at that moment. He couldn't just use a few to make things right because I wasn't some tiny kid anymore. You have my admiration, remarks. Furthermore, he never expressed regret or acknowledged his mistakes. I waited in the hopes that he may apologize and acknowledge the harm he had caused, but he never did. He seemed to believe that everything was now well, as if he had simply forgotten about everything, so I ought to. He made an attempt to discuss college with me one day, I recall. He inquired as to whether I had considered my educational goals or my intended destination. I told him I didn't know yet and shrugged. In all honesty, I didn't want to discuss my future with him since, in my opinion, he wasn't truly involved. I didn't want him engaged in my plans to move out and start my life on my own terms. I had spent so much time alone. The idea of his attempting to play dad now just felt offensive to me because I'd learnt to be self-sufficient. The tension between us was at an all-time high as graduation drew near. He persisted in attempting to portray us as a typical father and daughter couple navigating the usual challenges of adolescence. However, we weren't. Not by a long stretch. I was so enraged by him that I couldn't even look at him, and I believe he was aware of it because occasionally he would look at me with a dejected, nearly hopeless face, as if he had lost something but was unable to identify it. I put all of my money aside for my work. I was determined to get out as quickly as possible. Where I went didn't matter to me, only that I would be able to breathe at last, a place where I was not forced to continue living in this peculiar shadow of a family. I became increasingly restless as I approached the age of 18, feeling as though I was counting down the days until I would be free. I recall packing up my belongings in my room the night before I moved out, taking in the walls and reflecting on all the memories I was leaving behind. It was a bittersweet experience. I had spent the best years of my life with my mother here, where I had grown up and called home. However, it was no longer that location. Since he had sold her ring, no, not when he had picked them instead of me. Before I departed, Dad made an effort to speak with me. He appeared to be trying to express something important as he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. But it was all he could do. Despite our disagreements, you will always remain my daughter. I simply nodded, smiled artificially, and remained silent. I was unwilling to argue with him. I didn't want to prolong the farewell in my mind. As soon as Dad sold that ring, he no longer had the right to refer to me as his daughter. Without turning around, I packed my belongings in my car and drove off. I had enough money saved up to rent a modest apartment. Not much. It's a little space that is just large enough to swing a cat. But the most important thing was that it was mine. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. There was no continual reminder of the treachery I had experienced or the family I had lost. I had the opportunity to start afresh, and it was just me and my space. Being alone felt strange at first. It seemed strange to be really independent after so many years of fending for myself. However, as the days went by, I began to establish a routine. I would get up, leave for work, and return home to a pleasant, almost tranquil feeling. Dad and his new family weren't a concern for me. Their drama and the continual reminders of what had transpired were not something I had to cope with. Dad, of course, made an effort to communicate. Occasionally, he would phone and leave lengthy voicemails inquiring about my well-being. He said he missed me. Most of them I disregarded. I would occasionally listen, but just out of interest. A part of me kept hoping he would apologize. said he wanted to make amends after realizing his mistake. However, the apology never materialized. It was always the same old, "I just want to hear from you," or "I miss you," as if he was unable to comprehend my reasons for leaving or my refusal to speak with him. A few months later, I was hired for the first time, something that would pay my payments and allow me to keep the flat. I enjoyed the simplicity of life. I didn't need sympathy or assistance. I felt proud to have made it on my own. I didn't know how much leaving had altered me until much later. I was more protective and harder. I understood what it was like to have your most trusted individuals betray you, so I didn't allow them in easy. Nevertheless, a small part of me still desired closure in spite of everything. That was curious as to whether he ever felt sorrow for his actions. However, I had no intention of waiting for that response. I had waited too long for him to act morally and be the father I needed. I had finished it. Moving out was about letting go of everything that had been holding me back, not simply about obtaining my own place. And that was the finest choice I had ever made, in my opinion. I had spent some time alone. I honestly didn't miss them by that point, since I had become accustomed to the freedom and tranquility. Being able to live without worrying about family strife or whether Dad would ever apologize brought a certain freedom. I believed that I had finally moved on from it. Then one day I get a call from my dad, and it's totally unexpected. He said, "Hello, kiddo," and I had nearly forgotten what it sounded like. He wasted no time in explaining me the cause for his call, that his wife's daughter was ill once more and that the cancer had returned, in that clumsy, phony, happy voice he employed whenever he had terrible news. He sounded tense, as if he were already preparing for the question he would have to pose, and I secretly knew that he had just one purpose for contacting me after all this time. As it happens, I was correct. He was requesting money after all these years had passed. I wasn't apologizing when my own father called, to beg for a handout to assist his new family, not to make amends. He spoke for a long time about how they were struggling financially and that every little amount would help since they were drowning in medical costs. Before he remarried, Dad told me about the money he had saved for me. He had saved a few $1,000s for my future when I was young, but it wasn't much. However, he hoped I would help. It was like being slapped across the face. After everything, I asked him directly why he believed I would want to assist. He stammered, as he attempted to clarify that he believed that perhaps enough time had gone by, and that I obviously no longer harbored resentment. He said that I had the opportunity to change things for a good cause, as if all of this were some kind of heroic deed. There isn't another option for him to escape the catastrophe he created. I didn't hold back. I expressed my precise thoughts to him, that after selling my mother's ring, he had no right to ask me for anything. Given that he had never bothered to apologize, I remarked it was offensive that he even believed I would give it any attention. He said that I should let go of the past and that I was being unreasonable. He seemed sincere in his belief that I was at fault for my anger over the ring. He then began discussing his stepdaughter's illness, claiming that I need to show sympathy for her because she didn't deserve this. I informed him that empathy is reciprocal. After reminding him that he had chosen them above me and my mother's memories, I pretended that everything was all right. I assumed that he had finally understood when he became silent, but I was mistaken. "I wish you could let it go," he added with a sigh. I realized then that he would never truly understand. Then I got a call from his wife. She tried to guilt-trip me by sending emails, leaving voicemails, and sending texts. She would say things like, "We're family, it's about saving a child's life and it's not about you. We ought to support one another." Honestly, it had the opposite impact of what she had hoped, that somehow bringing up the family card would make me give up. Every message served as a reminder of how they had rejected me as a child. Now that they were in need of money, I was family. However, at the time, I was only a bother that should be ignored. After a period of neglecting her, she attempted something different. She once left me a lengthy message explaining how the ring had saved her daughter's life and that I should be thankful it was used for something so important. It was so daring that I couldn't even speak. She was genuinely attempting to paint me as the villain because I wanted to preserve my mother's final gift. That one, I didn't even answer. I just blocked her number and erased it. But it didn't stop there. She managed to include the rest of the family somehow. Uncles, aunts, and even cousins who didn't really know me as a child. They all began commenting and sending me direct messages. Others just shared passive-aggressive content about family values and prioritizing others on social media. It was tiring and it was a circus. In an attempt to find some calm, I ultimately deleted a few of my social media accounts. However, I received a note from my grandma one evening. She generally keeps to herself and is rather laid back, but this time she was obviously drawn into the chaos. She sent this lengthy, uncomfortable note about the importance of family unity and the unbearably difficult period my dad's stepdaughter was going through. I was sick of feeling guilty, yet I felt sorry for her. I replied simply, saying that my dad had already decided on his family when he sold the ring years prior, and that they were short on funds, so he didn't get to come crawling back now. I could see it had hurt when she didn't reply, but I wasn't going to say I was sorry for establishing limits. When I happened to see my dad's wife in public, things reached a new low. She suddenly materialized in the center of the aisle just in front of me, as I was minding my own thing, picking up some goods. I initially assumed she would simply pass by or act as though she didn't notice me. However, no. She immediately launched into her rant about how self-centered I was and how abhorrent it was that I would even consider retaining the money when her daughter was in critical condition. I had had enough of holding back. She was fortunate that I hadn't filed a lawsuit when my dad sold the ring, I told her, adding that it had meant more to me than she or her daughter could ever know. I reminded her that I had the right to keep the money I had, and that there were other options for assistance if she was in dire need of money. She gave me the devil eyes, murmured something under her breath, and hurried away. People were gazing at me, but I didn't mind. I refused to allow her to coerce me into sacrificing what little security I still had, leaving that shop. I was strangely relieved. I had suppressed my fury for so long that it had been simmering under the surface. But in the end, I defended myself. I had set a boundary, made it clear to her where I stood, and refused to back down. Indeed, that was better than just having them guilt-trip me, even though it seemed a bit cruel. Then there was a period of silence. I stopped receiving calls and messages from unidentified family members. They must have known I wouldn't back down, but I couldn't shake the nagging sensation, the tiny voice in the back of my mind that kept asking me whether I was wrong. Even though they had wronged me and had no right to demand my money, I couldn't help but question whether I was being too harsh. Perhaps I had simply become so accustomed to feeling anger that I had lost the ability to feel anything else. Even though I knew I had done nothing wrong, it was difficult to get rid of the shame. Still, I couldn't stop doubting myself. That's the problem with family. They are fully aware of the most painful spot to strike you. And there's this part of you that questions whether they're correct, even while you're advocating for yourself. Ultimately, though, I had to tell myself that I had endured their decisions and indifference to my feelings for years, and I wasn't going to let them to reintegrate. Just because they didn't like my response didn't mean I was going to let them ruin the life I had finally begun to establish for myself. So I stood my ground, blocked them once again, and went on. I kept telling myself I was doing it anyhow. Following the altercation with my dad's wife in the grocery shop, I hoped that everything would eventually settle down. I had been honest with her about my feelings, and I thought that perhaps, just possibly, they would understand and stop bothering me. If anything, though, after a few days, things only became worse. It appeared as though the entire extended family had made the decision to organize an intervention. All of a sudden, everyone had an idea about what I need to do and how I should put things right. Family helps family, according to these sporadic texts I would receive from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some of them continued by saying that I was being unforgiving and that harboring grudges only makes the bearer sick. They seemed to be reading from the same screenplay, which my dad or his wife had most likely supplied. It seemed as though they portrayed me as the antagonist, someone who was too heartless to assist a sick child, which couldn't be further from the reality. The worst thing was when they began tagging me in social media posts. When we're gone, I'd see these guilt-trippy quotes on my page. Family is all we have, and a heart that is able to forgive is also capable of healing. I would roll my eyes till I could almost see my own brain. I ultimately made the decision to remove several of them. I didn't require that kind of coercion or manipulation, but naturally, it resulted in further drama as I received messages asking how I might be deleted. You're behaving as though you don't belong in your own family. I simply stopped paying attention to everything because it became so absurd. But they persisted. My dad's sister, with whom I hardly ever communicated, sent me a lengthy email a few days later. She said that family was all we had in this world and that I should be compassionate even before all of this. As though I hadn't gone through my own experience and had my own sentiments about it, she really had the audacity to say that I was too young to comprehend. It seemed as though no one could see my side of the story, as though I was just expected to set aside years of pain and betrayal because they felt it was convenient. However, it was a group communication from my dad's parents that really got me upset, because they had been close to my dad's bride from the start and believed she would give him fresh life after my mom died. My grandparents were always a touch aloof with me. They acted as though her daughter was as much their grandchild as I was, and they essentially regarded her as a savior. However, they went one step farther with this communication. Although they acknowledged that I was still sad, they said that I needed to move on from the past. They discussed how my dad's stepdaughter was like family and how it was my duty as her elder brother to help her through this difficult time. We know your mom would want you to do the right thing, they concluded. For me, it was it. I felt like I was hit in the stomach by that final statement regarding my mother. Here they were, recalling my mother. In the first place, they hardly regarded it, in an attempt to coerce me into paying them money. I recall feeling a mixture of despair and wrath as I simply stared at the television. When they sold the ring, it seemed as though they didn't just take away the final remnant of her to make me feel worse. They were now bringing up her memories in this mess. That evening, I took a seat and composed a reply. I was not going to remain silent any longer. Since they had hardly recognized my mother after she passed away, I informed them that they had no right to bring her up and that they had no clue what she would have wanted. I informed them that my dad had no right to sell the ring because it had been mine and mine alone. I explained everything, the treachery, the grief, everything. I also warned them that I would have to break off communication if they didn't respect my decision to avoid becoming involved in their problem. I sat there with a strange sensation of relaxation after hitting submit. I was unsure of their reaction, but I didn't give a damn. I had finally expressed my feelings to them rather than keeping them to myself for the first time. Naturally, however, the repercussions was virtually instantaneous. My granny first apologized grudgingly, stating she was sorry I felt that way. This type of non-apology essentially states, "I'm sorry you're angry, but I'm not going to make things better." Then family members began falling like flies, one by one. People unfriended me, blocked me, and my phone became silent. I refused to tell lies. Although it was painful, I felt as though a burden had been lifted. I didn't have to put up with the incessant manipulation or constantly defending myself. Then my father arrived at my house. It had been months, perhaps a year since I'd last seen him. I didn't anticipate it. I froze, therefore, as I opened the door and found him standing there. He appeared older. He seemed more exhausted, as if the situation had worn him out. However, I could tell he wasn't there to make amends the moment he opened his lips. "I assumed you would at least be civil enough to speak to me directly, looking around as if you didn't want to be there," he said. I leaned against the doorframe with my arms folded. "Discuss what? You've long since made up your mind." He let out a sigh as though I were the one acting irrationally. "I am making every effort to assist your sister." That word was his. I was furious at sister. I was quite straightforward with him, telling him that she was his wife's daughter and not my sister. He gave me a look as though I had smacked him, but I had no intention of giving up. I wasn't going to allow him to change the course of history because it suited him after all this time. "Why are you unable to let it go?" He shook his head in question. "Are you harboring resentment against a ring?" I snapped that it wasn't simply a ring. Mom's ring was on it. "And you sold it as if it didn't exist. And now, as if I owe you something, you're returning for more." For what seemed like an eternity, we stood silently. Ultimately, he simply sighed, looked down and uttered, "You're not the person I raised." At that, I gave a little sour laugh. "No, I'm not. You spent years ignoring me while you established a new life with your new family, and you want me to fix it now that it's coming apart. I'm finished, Dad. Without saying another word, I'm done being your fallback option." I took a step back, shut the door and secured it. He remained there for a minute, appearing disoriented as if he was still in shock over what had just transpired, as I observed from the window. He eventually turned and left. He drooped his shoulders. It ought to have been gratifying, perhaps even victorious. However, it didn't. It simply felt definitive. I sat in my flat with an odd mixture of melancholy and relief. I felt as though a phase of my life had suddenly finished, and I had no idea what was next. However, I was certain that I would not allow him or anybody else to use guilt to coerce me into participating in their drama once more. I wasn't going to allow them to pull me back down, since I had worked too hard to get here. I felt truly free for the first time. I was no longer caught up in their guilt trips or expectations. I could simply concentrate on getting ahead and taking care of myself. I knew I had taken the correct decision, even though I would probably always wish things had turned out differently. It seemed as though everything had finally come together once I closed the door on my dad. In years, for the first time. I didn't feel like I was always waiting for an apology or recognition that would never materialize. I let it all out, told him how I truly felt, and ended it the way I wanted. And I was truly done for the first time. At first, the ensuing quiet was almost unnerving. I had grown accustomed to the incessant background noise of family turmoil after all the calls, messages, and guilt trips. Now, however, there was just tranquility. No arbitrary phone calls, no passive-aggressive posts from distant family members on social media. I had no one to tell me how I should feel. It was just me, my tiny apartment, and the life I had created. Naturally, questions began to surface despite all of that freedom. Leaving someone you've known your entire life, no matter how badly they hurt you, can be difficult at times. Holidays or sporadic weekends come to mind. When my dad was truly around, I would have that strange mixture of sorrow and nostalgia. However, I would quickly get over it when I thought about the last several years and the ongoing treachery. I would tell myself that I could be happy without them. Work was really helpful. I gave my job my all, worked long hours, and made an effort to better myself. Additionally, I began forming new friendships over time. People who didn't know about all the turmoil and didn't treat me like the girl with family problems or the estranged daughter. I felt like I could finally move on from my past without it weighing me down, and it was wonderful. A month or so after my most recent altercation with my father, one of the few people who hadn't taken sides in the entire situation was my aunt, who sent me a note. She had always been more of a neutral party. She would occasionally check in or send a brief text on my birthday, but she never got particularly engaged. She said that after everything with the family, she simply wanted to make sure I was doing okay. I intended to disregard it in part. Let sleeping dogs rest, please. However, I was interested, so I sent her a casual note in return. I assured her that everything was well and that I was concentrating on my work and avoiding the turmoil. She seemed to be trying to avoid saying too much since she responded with a lot of, "I understand, and that must have been hard." Then she suddenly revealed something shocking. It seems that in between the medical expenditures, my dad and his wife had experienced financial difficulties, their additional costs, as well as any other issues they had been facing. They were overworked. My aunt intimated that they were having more difficulties than I had thought, but she did not elaborate. In order to pay off whatever debt they may have accrued from the treatments and other expenses, they would even list their home for sale. I should have felt anything when I heard that. Perhaps a twinge of sympathy, perhaps a sense of fulfillment, perhaps even a twinge of remorse. To be honest though, I felt absolutely nothing. It was as though I had come to the finish of a tale that I had long since given up on. I didn't mean to hurt them, but I also wasn't going to rush back to their aid. They had made the same decisions that I had. "I thought you should know it's still family after all," my aunt concluded her message. And for a time, that portion stayed with me. When they treat you like an afterthought, what exactly does family mean? When they don't genuinely care about you, they simply seek out because they need something? I understood that I owed them nothing just because we were related. DNA was only one aspect of family. It was about individuals that truly cared about you, respected you, and thought highly of you. It wasn't them either. I returned my attention to those who had supported me in the months that followed. Not out of duty, but out of real concern. My friends, the distant relatives, checked in. I began to realize that my chosen family was far more valuable than the one I was born into. Over the years, I'd had enough of my dad and his wife. I refused to let them disturb my tranquility. The calls and mails eventually stopped altogether. I suppose they finally understood that I wouldn't be their bulwark and that they couldn't use shame or familial devotion to keep me accountable. And that was okay with me. I had tried to be the daughter they want for far too long, awaiting their arrival to respect me. However, those times were past. I had had enough of waiting for an unattainable goal. People who weren't fully informed might occasionally inquire about my family, new acquaintances, workplace, etc. They would ask whether you have siblings or if you are close to your parents. And I just respond, "No, it's just me," with a smile. It seemed right, and it was simpler that way. I didn't have to go into all the drama or provide the entire narrative. They only wanted to know that I was doing okay by myself. And to be honest, for the first time in my life, I was more than fine. I felt as though I was finally living for myself and not always watching my back to see if my dad might change his mind. I didn't require his forgiveness or his approval. I had allowed myself to go on and let go, and I needed no more closure than that. I had built a life that was all mine at the end of the year. I had a successful career. Compared to my own family, my close-knit circle of pals felt more like family. And I had at last come to terms with all that had transpired. I had lost my anger. I was unharmed. I had endured everything, experienced every bit of that suffering, and emerged from it stronger. In retrospect, I saw that I had truly been freed by losing them. I had to find strength because of that. I was unaware that I needed to defend myself in ways I never would have imagined. And although it wasn't simple, it was worthwhile. For the first time, I was living with people who truly cared about me and on my own terms. I am now at last putting a permanent end to that chapter. Don't ponder what may have happened. No more holding out for unanswered apologies. Just me going about my life without the burden I had carried for so long. I might not have the family I had hoped for. I may nevertheless take pride in my life, and I think that's plenty.